Hello and welcome along to another EFL Manager special from the Honest Football Podcast. I'm joined by Charlie as always, and we've got a brand new manager to talk about this time. We're talking, of course, about Doncaster Rovers, who have appointed Richie Wellens, one of their former players, as the new first team manager at the club. He made 199 appearances across 2 spells there, as they talk about in the statement, and of course most recently managed Salford and has the bizarre stat of his last game being winning a trophy. So, Charlie, we're going to talk about it in a bit of detail. The former man, obviously what happened with Darren Moore, which we talked a bit about in the Sheffield Wednesday one, and then the interim spell since. But for now, Charlie, your initial reaction to Richie Wellens being appointed, what are your thoughts on it?
I think it's quite an astute appointment, actually. I think the thing is, if you look at his managerial career, I know you mentioned obviously about him being a player there, that gives you an edge. But as a manager, Oldham, maybe didn't quite go the way he wanted. But I would argue that, even in my line of work, I'm sure the same as yours, your first year or two in a job is always, when you're in a new role, it's always difficult to find your feet a little bit. So I sort of take that out. You then look at Swindon, albeit points per game. I know that whole contentious issue of that, but he's still gotten promoted. And that's one thing you can't take away from that. And then he did win a trophy at Salford. The only caveat I'm putting is that basically Oldham and Swindon have then sort of gone into financial difficulty since but I think that's purely coincidental. And obviously maybe we spoke about Salford before and some of the things that go on there. I think it's a very astute appointment. I think as a fan, I'd be quite excited because he does play good football. I think that's one thing that you can say about his teams, that they are, they're definitely not long ball merchants, for want of a better phrase. So you will be entertained. There is risks that come with that. There is going to be games where you're going to leave yourself open. But I think from an entertainment perspective, and it might just be a bit of a continuation of where Darren Moore got him up to last year. Obviously, we'll go on to that in a bit. But for me, I think it's quite an astute appointment considering, where he's been, what he's achieved so far, and like you say, his history of the club.
Yeah, and I guess I wanted to ask you sort of about his appointment. Do you think this is probably a good move for both parties? Because not just for the Doncaster side, as you mentioned, but for him, he was obviously sacked from a League Two club after winning the EFL trophy against a League One club. And he now finds himself at a club that, until they lost their manager, were fighting for the playoffs in League One. It's got to be a good move for both.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, you could argue that's where he should have been anyway, because obviously he got Swindon promoted. The move from Swindon to Salford, I'm sure he'll be able to shed some light on that one day, but it was a slightly bizarre move in a sense. But the fact is that he's a good enough manager to be in League One, and it's a fantastic opportunity for him and a club that I would like to think will give him time to impart what he wants to impart on them. They're not, Doncaster aren't that sort of club that are going to go hiring and firing left, right and centre as has been seen over the last few years. And they've been fairly astute in their appointments up to this point. So I think it's a good move for the club. But like you say, for him as well, to get that opportunity to potentially, I'm sure we'll go on to it in a bit, being around that playoff picture to get into the Championship, going from a team in League Two where you could argue didn't have complete control over the team to then where he is now potentially. I think it's a fantastic move for both parties, like you say.
Yeah, and I think we need to move on to Doncaster here because Richie Wellens aside, obviously they started last season with Darren Moore. They were absolutely flying at the start, up in the top 2. They were just starting to drift while Darren Moore was still there, which I think some people forget now, given what happened towards the end of the season. But he did still leave them in the playoffs. And in the end, under interim charge from Andy Butler, probably putting the caveat in of another former player, albeit he was one without experience. 4 wins, 3 draws and 11 defeats in 18 games. And they actually ended up finishing in the bottom half. So do you say, as Richie Wellens, it's great that I'm taking over a side that has that potential to fight for the playoffs? Or do you think this could be a problem? I'm taking over a side that have lost over half of their last 18 games.
I see what you're saying. I think the thing is that there must be something there that got them up to that stage in the first instance. I think that they are lacking a few goals. A lot of the goals, have come from in and around midfield, just chipping in here and there, 5, 6, 7 goals. So that's something he needs to address. But obviously the losses would have been a bit of an issue. I think that you look at the stats, they concede goals throughout the whole game at different points. It's not as if there's a clear way of working out where. But prior to that, actually under Darren Moore, they weren't the worst defensively. I think there's, like you said, those 18 games since then have gone against them a bit. So I think there is green shoots there. I do think that he has to probably address the bit up front. Obviously, James Coppinger's gone now as well, which, in and around the club will be a big loss, but maybe a bit of youthful exuberance. And the style of football he likes to play and the formations he likes to use, I think might be better suited anyway to them, if they've got players chipping in from goals from all over the park, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that is one of the key things, is they started the season on fire in front of goal, but the second half of the year, it's very easy to look at the table and say they're actually decent scorers, but the second half of the year, they're in the bottom 10 for goals scored. So that does highlight where the problem is. The goals conceded column was pretty adventurous all season, but I think you mentioned the fact that Darren Moore played that style of football to an extent, and we've even seen it since at Sheffield Wednesday. But moving forward to Richie Wellens for next season, you mentioned the fact that Obviously, Andy Butler, who was in interim charge, had played 10 of the League One games before he took over. James Coppinger is basically deserves a statue at the club. He's that sort of territory. So it's going to be a bit of an overhaul, not so much in maybe the 10, 15 players going in and out that we see at other clubs, but the fact that such important spearhead figures, such leaders at the club are going. Do you see that as a negative in that he's going to have a far more inexperienced squad, or potentially a positive that he can find his own type of leaders?
I think you've got the possibility of, like you say, other people coming to the fore, but you then have got to try and, I think there's a vacuum, and you have to, as a manager, I think you have to fill that very quickly. And I'm not saying that this would happen in this squad, but you are then leaving yourself open to a possible, not revolt, but, people start to have different ideas, and you start to fracture a little bit as a club. And that's one thing that you definitely don't want when you first come in there. So I think he needs to go in and fill that vacuum very quickly, whether it is a bigger name signing of another experienced player, not quite James Coppinger, obviously, but do you know what I mean? Or whether it's like an appointment within his backroom staff that's really going to inspire people. But I think he needs to do something a little bit, not headliney, but something that's going to stamp his sort of authority on this. Because if you leave that vacuum there for too long, and that happens at grassroots football level as well, you can get a little bit of problems. Similar sort of thing at Swindon. Obviously, he took them, albeit after being sacked. His reputation wasn't necessarily the best after Oldham, and he did really well in that situation at Swindon. So I think he's a fairly resilient character anyway, to come back from where he was with there and achieve what he did at Swindon. And I sort of expect the same here. Obviously, didn't end at Salford the way he wanted it to off the pitch. I mean, on the pitch, I don't really know what else he could have done, but off the pitch, I think he'll come back from this in a similar way he did at Swindon, almost in that sense.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, he's going to get a little bit of time just because of the fact that he's a bit of a Doncaster legend on the pitch. He was part of a playoff success with them. He won Player of the Year there before. He's got that pedigree with the fans. But we've got to move to that point where we talk about what's going to happen in the future. You mentioned his previous jobs at Swindon, over 40% win rate. At Salford, even though it was only 36, he won a trophy and they didn't lose many. A lot of draws in there as well, which we've seen from Salford all season. And even at Oldham, where you mentioned that first job where it wasn't quite so great in terms of win percentage, only 32, they drew nearly half the games he was in charge. So there's still not many defeats in there. You could argue that he actually makes a team very solid despite playing pretty nice football on the eye. So what do you see for next season with Doncaster? Do you see them being that playoff and promotion contender that they were under Darren Moore? Or do you see them perhaps drifting as they were under Andy Butler towards the end?
I see this as a perfect storm. I can't see there being a reason why they can't be in and around that. Whether they'll make the playoffs, I don't know, because it's maintaining that for a whole season. And that is the risk, unfortunately, sometimes you could level with the approach of people like Richie Wellens. Is it's great, but once you get worked out, do you have a plan B, that kind of thing? And there are times, as we know, fixtures come thick and fast. Sometimes it is a bit harder to keep that high intensity of pressing and football that he does like to play. So you need a big squad for that. Are you going to get that in League One? Possibly not. So I think this year will be a year of transition. I think they'll be in and around that playoff picture, almost similar to last year. Not as dramatic a fall. I think they'll have a flying start. I think you have the new manager bounce for quite a while. And as I say, the excitement, the intensity of the way he likes to play, I think they might then fall off towards the end of the season. But the following year will be a second year. I think even an automatic promotion, as long as he's given the time, which I can't see why he wouldn't be, and he can keep hold of the nucleus of that squad, add a few people up front, possibly, as we mentioned earlier. I think maybe next year, in and around the playoffs, filter off, but the following year, possibly automatic promotion for me.
Yeah, fair enough. I think that's one of the fair points, isn't it? Is that League One next year, we've almost talked about it, it's basically going to be a second championship, given 8 or 9 of the sides that you're going to list in there. And if we get to a season, which let's hope for the world it's not, but if there is a season that's at all affected by the pandemic, where the schedule's tightened whatsoever, the bigger clubs, reputation-wise, the bigger budgets, now the salary cap isn't coming in, are going to be the ones that can build a 25, 30-man squad to cope with that. Whereas clubs like, and I take Luton season when we went up, we had a very tight squad. It was probably 18, 19 players that played 90% of the games, and Doncaster are a club like that. And when you have those seasons that work out, we've seen before, they can shock the odds. They can do well at this level and in a championship. So I'm sort of flirting with saying they'll nick into the playoffs. But I agree with you. In my book, they're going to be somewhere between 6th and 9th. And I don't want to sit on the fence and say that they're not going to make 6th place. So I'm going to say they're going to drop. They're going to be 7th or 8th. But I agree with you. If he's given time, there is no way in my book that they won't be in the top 6 by the end of the second season. We can't underestimate the impact of losing the legends and the players that have had such an influence on the dressing room. But if you get another year to build your own leaders, I think they'll be right up there. And I agree with you completely. It's a really astute appointment. So you're going for top half next season, but not the playoffs. Is that what we're saying?
I would say so, yeah. Maybe a slight fall, maybe 8th, 9th, 10th, that sort of area.
So we're pretty much in agreement, which makes a change for these sorts of things, I guess. Normally one of us goes bold. We both agree that Doncaster should give Richie Wellens time, and I think we're both in agreement it's a good appointment. But as I've said many times on these over the summer, it doesn't matter what we think. If you're a Doncaster fan, let us know in the comments. Are you excited about the appointment? Are you happy to see a former player back? And what are your expectations for the next season or two? And how are you going to replace the club legends? Let us know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, please do chuck a thumbs up on it. Subscribe down below for regular content from the Honest Football Podcast. Thank you to Charlie for joining me as always. You can follow us on Twitter at HonestFootball3, and hopefully we'll see you next time.